Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome to this Cold War International History Project afternoon seminar and book launch for Jim Mann's new book, New Look Back, Reagan and the End of the Rebellion of Ronald Reagan, A History of the End of the Cold War. Delighted to welcome, oh, here we go. There's some more seats up front. Delighted to welcome Jim back, who is a longtime friend of the center and partner in a variety of Cold War project conspiracies and events and activities over the years. He's, of course, familiar to all of you as he's affiliated with Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced Studies, where he's author at residence, and he's, of course, familiar to most of you as the former Washington correspondent and Beijing bureau chief for the LA Times. He has published an incredible number of well-known books that we were just discussing out front. His prolific activity is just in the last few years. His books include The China Fantasy, How Our Leaders Explain Away Chinese Repression, published in 2007, The Rise of the Vulcans, The History of Bush's War Cabinet, 2004, About Face, A History of America's Curious Relationship with China, From Nixon to Clinton, published in 1999, and Beijing Jeep, published 10 years earlier in 1989. One of his latest books is, of course, the one that he'll be talking about here today at the Cold War Project, very appropriately. It's on the end of the Cold War, in particular Ronald Reagan's role, a subject that has preoccupied us here at the Cold War Project, here at the Wilson Center on a number of occasions, often from the other side, from Gorbachev's and the Soviet side of the equation. Jim has taken advantage of these materials as well as a lot of other materials that have recently become available, and he'll share some of those findings with us this afternoon. He'll talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'd like to quickly go over to Q&A, and we'll go until about 5:15 if necessary. Let me welcome you again. Jim, you have the floor.
Christian, thank you, and thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to do something a little different today and give a general introduction to the book of the kind that I've done in a number of places, and then try and switch specifically for this audience, for an audience knowledgeable about the Cold War, to what I think is new in the book in terms of materials. In general, this actually, I try to tell people, is a tough book for people in different parts of the political spectrum in different ways, because the book is really about the difference between Ronald Reagan as symbol and Reagan as he actually was during the 8 years he was in office. And in particular, the focus of the book really is on Reagan's second term and Reagan's diplomacy with Gorbachev. And so, a lot of what gets said about Reagan now, certainly in political debates, is Reagan in retrospect rather than as events actually transpired. So, and the focus really is on the political dynamics of this second term, roughly, Reagan's last 3 years of the White House. And I try to remind people that there are different dynamics in foreign policy in different periods, that we, with very good reason, tend naturally to think of American foreign policy disputes in Washington as regularly battles between, you can call them as you will, but you're familiar, realists and neoconservatives, or moralists versus people interested in American interests. And certainly that fits the politics we're familiar with from the last decade on Iraq, and it actually fits many of the debates of the 70s and the early 80s. It doesn't fit this period. Between roughly 85 or 86 and 88, Reagan and his Secretary of State, George Shultz, run into opposition and are the targets of attack, both by conservatives and neoconservatives, and by the so-called realists, sometimes separately and sometimes together. I mean, this is the period, the relevant quote, and I did try, probably more than has been done before, to put the political debates over Reagan's policy into this book, and to collect what the columnists were saying and what politicians were saying. The representative quote from George Will in 1988, one of his columns, one of the many columns attacking Reagan's policies. 4 years ago, many people considered Reagan a keeper of the Cold War flame. Time flies. For conservatives, Ronald Reagan's foreign policy has produced much surprise but little delight. This is an era when the National Review, then the leading organ of conservatives, published an essay with great approval by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, because they too were criticizing Reagan and Shultz. And there are really two internal debates in Washington within U.S. policy. One is over nuclear policy, and I think many of you are familiar with the Reykjavik summit, Reagan's talk of abolishing nuclear weapons, and the debate that engendered within the foreign policy community here. The other debate, the real debate, is simply about Gorbachev. What are his intentions? Who is he? What kind of foreign policy will he have? And I think the representative view I do describe in the book Richard Nixon's visit to Moscow. It's the mid-1986. And Nixon meets Gorbachev for the first time. Nixon really enjoyed comparing one Soviet leader to another, and he fell into what I call the metallurgy of the Cold War. Brezhnev used a meat axe in negotiations. Gorbachev uses a stiletto. But beneath the velvet glove he always wears, there is a steel fist. It's one of the many times in this period where these old comparisons of Soviet leaders to iron, steel, flinty eyes recur. And what people are missing is the fact that Gorbachev really doesn't represent the same old Soviet policies. He may, he certainly is, maintains his links, to say the least, to the pillars of Soviet power, but Soviet foreign policy is changing. The leading Henry Kissinger during this period is writing, Gorbachev and his associates seem less constrained by the past and more assertive with respect to Soviet power. So the question is, what is Gorbachev and what are his intentions? What's his foreign policy going to be? And this debate continues through Reagan's second term. Really, the first acknowledgement that Gorbachev represents something dramatically new for foreign policy. You begin to get it in 1987 when Gorbachev shows up at a Warsaw summit, and at which the military doctrine is changed, so that it's no longer asserted that there's no longer automatically a NATO or American enemy, something that creates problems in Eastern Europe. But the real significant change is at the end of 1988, when Gorbachev shows up at the United Nations, gives a speech in which he announces he's cutting Soviet troops by 500,000. So those are the debates. Let me switch to what I think is new in the book as far as materials and what's not. This is ironic because as I usually talk about the book with general audiences, the overall point of view about the Reagan administration that seems so surprising to them will not or should not, I don't think, seem surprising to you all, which is that the Reagan administration's policies, particularly in its last 4 years, don't conform to the stereotype of them as purveyed now, I think, by any and all Republican candidates, or the sort of the triumphal view that Reagan gave the Berlin Wall speech. I think Dana Rohrabacher, a member of Congress, in an interview for this book, suggested that Reagan gave the speech and Soviet leaders met in Moscow and decided that really, if Reagan said it, he meant it, and they better do something about the Berlin Wall. Maybe someone in this room has found any evidence of that, but I didn't in the research for this book. So the point of view that the Reagan administration's policies don't conform to the popular image of them, I think will be familiar to you, and it really, in different ways, and I may write it differently, but follows along the lines of first and generation histories of the period, follows along the lines of memoirs starting with George Shultz himself, Secretary of State, or Jack Matlock, follows along the memoirs of conservatives who wrote unhappily about where Reagan's policies ended up in his second term, such as Tom Reed, one of the sort of early Hawks conservatives in the Reagan administration. If you look closely, the memoir of Richard Pipes, who served on the NSC in Reagan's first term, and who expresses some disappointment that Reagan was not quite what he thought he was, that even at the peak of tensions in '83, Reagan is still emphasizing the importance of dialogue, high-level dialogue with the Soviet Union. So the overall point of view, I think, which strikes many people as a surprise, really is not a surprise. I spent a lot of time with U.S. files and archives as they're coming out, and I would highlight 3 or 4 things to you. The first, I paid particular attention to the internal debates, particularly between the right and Reagan, and between realists, meaning Nixon, Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, and Reagan during this period. I ran across what to me is just historically a wonderful memo, which Richard Nixon wrote to his files after a secret meeting in 1987. Nixon was brought to the White House. He had not really been inside and upstairs since the day he left. He'd been to a state dinner once downstairs. He was brought in because Reagan wanted his support in his symmetry with Gorbachev and for the arms control negotiations that led to the INF Treaty. Nixon refused to give it. The memos itself, wonderful reading. I think I should probably post it on the web, because Nixon is brought in by helicopter, goes in, takes a look at this office on the second floor of the White House that was once, even in his presidency, a bedroom. It's now an office. He looks around. He starts reminiscing about the first time he was ever in there. Lyndon Johnson invited him back to the White House from a White House dinner, and he had a long conversation with him about politics, and Nixon discovers later on that there's a taping system under the bed. And then he makes an awkward joke, "I hope this meeting isn't taped," and Reagan tries to laugh. But it really, this memo helps bring home really the differences and the different ways of thinking of Reagan and Nixon, the two leading anti-communist politicians, electoral politicians. Let's leave out different strands and different phenomena like Joe McCarthy, the two leading anti-communist politicians of the Cold War, who represent different kinds of thinking. So the Nixon material, I think, is new and of interest. The second is we tend to think, I know I did, but I think this is generally, people tend to have, without thinking of it, a bifurcated view of Reagan's diplomacy. There was his Soviet diplomacy, which went through the exalted channels of the National Security Council and the State Department. Formal channels went through George Shultz, Shevardnadze, Dobrynin, and so on. And then there's Iran-Contra, where Reagan used these strange unofficial intermediaries. Well, I spent a bunch of time with looking at Reagan's very irregular, informal advisor on Soviet affairs, a woman named Suzanne Massey, who had written the book Nicholas and Alexandra, certainly not about policy or diplomacy, who was brought into Reagan in 1984 to really begin to just talk to him about life in the Soviet Union. And Reagan took a liking to her. The fact that she was an informal advisor was the subject of some coverage at the time. What really showed up in the archives, and then I tried to flesh out, is that she also sometimes carried messages back and forth that people in Moscow, particularly at the Institute for the USA in Canada, would give her messages hoping to get them to Reagan. And Reagan occasionally sent messages back. And so I found in the archives some handwritten notes which Frank Carlucci verified that he had made of a conversation where Massey comes in to Reagan to talk about the summitry. Who should come first? Should Gorbachev come to Washington first? Should Reagan go to Moscow first? Gorbachev was worried about his security, he claimed, if he came to the United States, and so on. And all this is being conducted, again, through, in a quite irregular way, through an author. So that's another piece of what I think is new in this material. And then I did spend a lot of time on the Berlin Wall speech. What did it mean? In my view, this was the speech itself was the product of a battle that went on for about 3 months in the White House over whether Reagan should say these words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," or not. That was the view of really the foreign policy agencies, the State Department and the NSC, that those words were unduly provocative, might get Gorbachev in trouble, which they didn't want to do. And really, to say the least, you can understand their concern because the thrust of the impact of Reagan's policies is to build up Gorbachev. On the other side of the debate are the conservatives in the White House speechwriting office, tend to be movement conservatives, several recommended by William Buckley, and the White House Domestic Council, which is trying to revive the Reagan presidency in early 1987 from Iran-Contra. And this goes all the way up to Reagan. This produces, the files on this speech are very funny because they not only include efforts to scratch out Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The NSC and the State Department didn't like anything about the speech. There was a line in there from a Marlene Dietrich song, Ich habe einen Koffer in Berlin. I left a suitcase in Berlin. And there's a battle in which the NSC says, he shouldn't say this because it suggests that anybody might leave Berlin. We don't want people to leave Berlin. And anyway, Marlene Dietrich's a symbol of nostalgia. We don't want people in Berlin to be nostalgic. They argue about the language. Of course, the model for speeches in Berlin is John Kennedy's speech. So the first draft of this speech has Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall in German, and it doesn't seem to ring right, and it finally ends up in English. And I will leave that to you, except to say that there is a long account of this speech, and the impact of this speech is really not, as Dana Rohrabacher said, to produce some crisis in Moscow. The impact is really on Erich Honecker, who, as I think I put it, was not about to tear down the wall, but certainly would like to have been asked, because the speech says on its face that it's up to Gorbachev whether the wall stands. It's not up to the East Germans. And in fact, Honecker has a couple of diplomats asking after the speech whether, was this a change in the U.S. policy? I think I'm going to hold up there. I do have I did spend a bunch of time in Berlin on the German part of the book, and had one of the strangest book interviews I've ever had with one Egon Krenz, who was, of course, the East German leader in the 2 months or so before the fall of the wall in 1989. And who is now really so down and out. I have a policy of never paying for book interviews and still haven't. I was staying at the American Academy in Berlin, and he insisted on having them buy a train ticket for him to come from Rügen to Berlin for the interview, and then proceeded to sell me a book for 30 euros. And he has some wonderful accounts, particularly of Honecker's paranoia that the United States and the Soviets were conspiring against him. He also has a very nice account of the events of November 9th and 10th, 1989. Particularly, I like, and I'll stop with this, that the Soviet ambassador in East Berlin called him the day after the wall comes down as a result of a bunch of East German mistakes. They didn't intend things to happen the way they did, and says, "What are you doing?" And Krenz, who's prides himself now that he did not use force that day, is asked to send a letter justifying his policies to Moscow. And about 3 hours later, Krenz gets a call back from the Soviet ambassador saying, in the name of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, we congratulate you. It gives you some sense of probably of the internal tensions, which you all are much better familiar with within Moscow at the time. So I'm going to hold up there. I've talked long enough, and I'd love to hear your questions. I'm happy to cover any part of this you'd like.
Very good. Thank you so much. If you could, since this is being webcast live and will be archived later on our website, if you could wait for the microphone, and also please state your name and affiliation. We'll start up front here.
I'm Jerry Olick, retired intelligence agency. I have a comment and then a question. The comment's related to the question. In the mid-'80s, there was mounting evidence the Soviet Union was systemically changing. They had recognized their economic difficulties, and Gorbachev was instrumental in bringing this to the realization of the leadership. And this evidence was presented around the intelligence community, looked at, and in the State Department, it was suggested that we brief the Secretary of State Schultz on this development. And the director of intelligence advised us that we shouldn't give Schultz any more ideas and refused to let the State Department sponsor this briefing. But it was clear to us that Reagan, at some point, changed his mind significantly, as you portray in the second administration. My question is, what or who convinced Reagan, besides Schultz, Reagan to make this drastic change and use the arms control process in spite of the advice of his neocon anti-arms control people, and go forward with the INF Treaty and a different relationship with the Soviet Union?
First, on the intelligence debate, yeah, I certainly agree with you, and I will say, and many of you in this room are familiar with the fact that the intelligence community keeps publishing defenses of its predictions, that it did not miss what was happening in the Soviet Union, and I don't dwell on those in this book. I'm not persuaded. I find them unpersuasive. And in fact, apart from memories like yours, I mean, there are senior intelligence officials who say, we did this internal study and then we couldn't get it published, or we had the wrong headline. And really, I think some of this played out in years afterwards. For example, some of the debates over Gates' nominations, and he is, his own memoir. I would call it a modified limited hangout, would be the old Watergate phrase. Has acknowledged that during this sort of 85 to 88 period that he was wrong, or I think he says he had it. It was compatible with what they knew at the time. I mean, but. In short, I agree with you. They missed it. The subject of why did Reagan change? And I can give 4 or 5 answers which get you part of the way there. Okay, you mentioned Schultz, who was ever more influential as the second term went on, but not always. Schultz did not want Reagan to give the Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall speech, and it's the difference between a political leader and a diplomat. I mean, Schultz was doing what his job was. Reagan's job is to maintain public support. He was going to have to get an INF treaty through Congress, through the Senate, as he did, with over 90 votes. So he decides to go ahead with this tear down this wall speech, in part because it's bringing along his constituency. And I mean, don't get me wrong, he meant it as well. That's Schultz. There's Nancy Reagan, who again is influential, but also doesn't always get her way. There is Iran-Contra, and people do rightly say that Reagan's advisors after Iran-Contra wanted to revive his presidency, and the summitry was part of that. The problem with the Iran-Contra explanation is that the timing, the chronology doesn't work, because the Reykjavik, the Reykjavik summit is before Iran-Contra breaks, and the sequence of events leading to Reykjavik, which I won't take you through, but it sort of starts with the Soviet detention of Nicholas Danilov in the fall of '86. All of that predates Iran-Contra. So, it's something you hear on the street, oh, yeah, well, this was all a reaction to Iran-Contra. Well, that doesn't work. And let's see what other very short explanations there are. I guess that's about, those are the 3 that come up regularly. I think as every author finds, Reagan was incredibly opaque. He never explained his strategies. You never quite knew what was a strategy. To me, it was more instinct than strategy. You don't find you just don't find him explaining the fact that his policies don't match his actions. But when you add up all the others, there is some little piece there that you can't add up with, Schultz or Nancy Reagan or Iran Contra. That is Reagan's own instincts, and I guess that's what I'm trying to say in the book. He doesn't lay it out. He has himself. Someone was just asking me at Georgetown about memoirs, good memoirs and bad. Reagan's memoirs are not helpful at all. His diaries are incomplete. The secret meeting with Nixon that I described before is listed in the diaries as a meeting with, I think, Frank Carlucci and Baker. So there is a piece of this where that is Reagan, although he never explains it, I think.
Jim, can I push you just a little further? You've twice on this very issue, you've twice alluded to now the sort of bifurcated view of Reagan's policies, the Soviet deal and Iran-Contra. So how do you resolve it then?
Well, I guess the question, I find Reagan that the contrast is not as great as I find that in both cases Reagan is actually behind things. In Iran-Contra in ways that turn out, I should say, were knowable from the start to be illegal. Soviet policy, he goes ahead and works sometimes through normal channels and sometimes not. But that in both cases, he is actually, while seemingly very passive, directing the policies. And in both cases, while it looks like they're official channels, he's also going through, he's got unofficial channels as well. He's very passive. He lets others do the work from day to day, and he's remarkably detached from the day-to-day details. But for just overall political direction, it really comes down to him, for Iran-Contra as with Soviet policy.
Thank you. The gentleman all the way in the back. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Bat Sparrow at the Wilson Center. I was wondering, what's your account of, in the book you give a number of examples of Gorbachev's change, and what accounts for the realists such as Kissinger, Nixon, Scowcroft, Gates et al., missing those signs so consistently over those last couple of years of the Reagan administration?
If you read their arguments where they tend to give them the most in articles and op-eds, usually the first argument is this guy was a protege of Andropov, and so how could he possibly represent change? He is a product of the system, so they fail to recognize that a product of the system could also change the system. And secondly, really Gates, I think, is at the top of the list for this argument. We are not seeing the change. We're not seeing it yet. Therefore, they bend over backwards to say it's not changing. It probably won't change. That is, if there are not visible changes in military deployments, then the mistaken assumption is that there won't be. And I think there was a belief that really no one person was going to be able to change the system. That's really what it comes down to. Reagan, in his way that sounded simplistic, Reagan, who really had a deeply personalized view of of communists growing out of the 40s and his time in Hollywood. The corollary of that was that when he got into his summits with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev didn't conform to stereotype, was more willing to entertain the possibility that he was an agent for change.
Thank you. Gentleman up front here.
I'm Ron Davis, retired INR and defense intelligence analyst. And I was curious about, I haven't read your book, I just thumbed through it and I caught the National Security Decision Directive 75 caught my eye. And from what I could just pick up there in a few, just scanning it, you don't seem to put much credence in this. I wonder if you could, this was in effect the point of view by some that Reagan had basically a plan, came into office with a plan to basically undermine the Soviet Union through economic warfare. And this is gone into in some detail in another book, which you probably are familiar with, by Paul Kengor, the Crusader, who seems to give a lot more credence to this. I'd also like to follow up on the question that this gentleman had. When you said the community missed it, when you say that, could you be a little more specific what you mean by that? Because either now or in a follow-up, I'd like to discuss or talk about a briefing that I gave Reagan in 1982 on this subject.
Well, before I'd be happy to answer, but I'd love to hear about the briefing first, since if you're
briefly. We can go ahead, but briefly.
This was in March. As a matter of fact, it's in the Kengor's book, which I was quite stunned to see because he found it in Reagan's diary, where he mentioned this briefing. It was a briefing. My career was specialized on economic intelligence, and we had been following the Soviet economic situation for some time, starting around 1975. And by the early 80s, it was quite clear that there was some very, very serious cracks and pressures, extraordinary pressures. And that in that briefing in early 82, I explained the tremendous pressure that the Soviet Union was under, to the point that there was a tremendous debate over how and when and so forth to reallocate resources from the defense industrial sector to the civilian sector. And this was received with considerable interest by Reagan, and his comment was, I can hardly wait to get them to the bargaining table, to the negotiating table. The first President Bush, Vice President Bush at the time, was there, and his questions concerned more some other specifics concerning the impact of the grain embargo that we had imposed on the Soviet Union, and other questions. Richard Pipes was there as well, and some others. In any case, that's so. In my view, as far as I know, and my colleagues that have been, familiar with this, this was the first presentation. This was I was at Defense Intelligence at that time. This was the first presentation by the community, or at least by DIA, that these pressures were real, that the change was being discussed, and they were in very, very deep trouble.
Thank you.
By the way, what happened subsequent to that, which I won't get into now, but I'd be happy to discuss with you later, is I think quite interesting.
And that could you just shed just a sentence on what you're referring to?
What I mean is how this was received in the intelligence community, and not uniformly, and the various pressures apparently that were at play, political pressures and so forth, that as an analyst it's very difficult to pick up on. In any case,
let me make
but back to
two or three
to
points.
Wisdom 75. That I'm very interested in, because myself and several colleagues that were close to this at the time, and when the Ken Gore book came out, could not fathom. We were quite close to this, that we did not know there was such a plan.
That you didn't know there was such a
specific strategy and plan.
Well, actually, we have in the room the author of a book that published the directive for the first time, Mr. McFarlane. The order was significant. It took 3 years, a couple of years after Reagan was in office. I mentioned the Richard Pipes book before, and you will find that he, who played a role in drafting the order, the directive rather, also expresses some disappointment with Reagan, who at the same time stipulates that there should be nothing that comes in the way of high-level dialogue with the Soviets. So Reagan is carrying out a policy which is on 2 or 3 different tracks, and the track of diplomacy dominates the second term, and there are high-level debates, particularly in the first term, and to a lesser extent in the second term, about an effort to about what to do on the Soviet economy. I mean, the highest level advocate of the idea the United States did not bankrupt the Soviet Union was the leading hawk in the administration, Caspar Weinberger, who said, that's not why the Soviet Union collapsed. But I would emphasize this. You spoke about the pressures, the economic pressures on the Soviet leadership, and these were highlighted by the intelligence community. But the previous question was really on whether the intelligence community foresaw either a Soviet collapse or the upheavals or the end of the Cold War. And the debates that have taken place since then really are by the intelligence community saying, well, if you look at our NIEs or you look at our studies, we really did suggest what was going to happen. It reminds me, in a much more serious way, of reporters like me who used to say, "Well, we had that story; you just didn't see that paragraph on page 23." People like Senator Moynihan who took a different view, who suggested that really things were not as stable as the intelligence community foresaw. So I draw a distinction between pressures and an actual change in events in the Soviet Union.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions over here on the right side. Sure.
My name is Stephen Shore. I'm with the PBGC. Your book has an account, I think the first account ever given, that of Reagan asking Gorbachev whether he believed in God and saying that if this ever went public, he would deny it. So I have 2 brief questions. Why did Reagan care whether Gorbachev believed in God? And were there any other subjects that Reagan and Gorbachev talked about where Reagan said that he would deny it publicly that these conversations occurred?
If you could pass it just behind you. Yeah. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, there is an account in the book. This took place at the Moscow summit in 1988. At each of these summits, there are plenary sessions where the president meets with his Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, a bunch of people, and Soviet foreign minister, and so on. Sometimes 30 people in a room, even more. And then there are one-on-ones. They're called one-on-ones, but there are note-takers there, just not senior officials. And at this summit in 1988, which you could call Reagan's last summit. I mean, there's a meeting after Bush is elected during the transition as well. He really decides, in my view, on his own, to take a conversation that started with fairly familiar ground of an American president talking about the importance of freedom of religion in the Soviet Union, takes it the next step and begins to talk to Gorbachev about the importance about religious belief and being a religious believer, and he does it in a Reagan way of telling stories, which he did regularly with Gorbachev. And there's one about a soldier who looks up at the sky as he's dying, and he goes into the importance of religious belief. And Gorbachev tries to switch the subject and says, yeah, let's talk about space policy. And Reagan comes right back at him and says, no, what I'm talking about is further out than space, and tells him that his own son, Ron, is an atheist, and he always tells him, wants to ask him when he has a great gourmet meal if he thinks there was a chef. Reagan really is coming right at him, and in my view, this really is Reagan completely on his own. It's certainly not something that he discussed with his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. It shows up in the MEMCON, the now declassified transcript or account of the conversation. I did talk to the two note takers who took these, who were in on the meeting, and one of them, Tom Simons, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, said he thought maybe Reagan was being just sort of diversionary, as Reagan sometimes was. I mean, he told these stories sometimes for a purpose. And the other note taker said that no, he really did have the impression that Reagan was trying to convert Gorbachev. I do point out in there, actually, surprisingly, this was not the first time. This was extremely unusual. Jimmy Carter had, in a meeting with or a car ride, I believe, with Park Chung. The president of South Korea had asked him about, or tried to persuade him of the importance of religious belief. But it struck me as highly unusual, to say the least, and so I tried to provide as full an account as I could.
Thank you.
My name's Dan Lieberman. I just want to ask you the $64 million question. A lot of people give Reagan credit for both the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, while other people say, well, it was on its way anyway, and he was just the right person in the right place at the right time. Can I have your take on that situation?
Sure. I'm not sure I can give you the $64 million answer, but in my view, and I try to say this at the end of the book, it was not Reagan. Reagan didn't win the Cold War in the way that is commonly portrayed. I mean, that to me makes no sense at all. It was not a matter of Reagan making one decision or three decisions and bankrupting the Soviets. That really the Cold War ended. You can either, if you choose a day or a year, that it ended in either on November 9th and 10th, 89, when the wall comes down, or that whole year of 1989 when there are changes in Poland, Hungary, and so on, and eventually Czechoslovakia and Romania. And during that whole year, of course, Gorbachev does not intervene as one government after another is falling. And then, to me, it's fairly clear what's on Gorbachev's mind. Is he thinking, oh my gosh, the United States has this huge defense budget, I can't compete with it, therefore I'm not going to intervene? That just doesn't add. My gosh, the U.S. is proceeding with its strategic defense initiative, so I'm not going to intervene. To me, he wants a new relationship with the West. I'm not going to say that the defense buildup, as things like SDI, are factors in there, but the salient fact is that by '89 he wants an entirely different relationship with the West, and that this is the result of, in part, of the climate that has been built up between '85 and '89, largely in the second term of the Reagan administration. And so I probably should have read the final paragraph of my book, as I sometimes do. I didn't do that this time, but Reagan he helped create. It wasn't Reagan winning the Cold War; it was Gorbachev abandoning it. That Reagan's role was to help create the climate in which he would do that.
Thank you. I'd like to give Mr. McFarlane a chance to join the discussion.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Wilson Center.
Comment on the earlier discussion of whether there was a preconceived notion, strategy to consciously so stress the Soviet economy as to at least tax it, if not bring it down. The answer is no, in terms of the president coming to office with any kind of preconceived notion like that. The policy he developed that was reflected in SDD 75 was a product of about a year's study, and the leading contributors were Dick Pipes, Larry Eagleberger, and Pipes did feel that we should impose as large a burden as we could on this dysfunctional Marxist system, but none of us had any illusion that it would, in our lifetimes even, necessarily bring it down. It was, however, a contributing factor to the decision to launch the Strategic Defense Initiative, not so much on the president's part. His foundation for that was more a moral revulsion at the notion of the idea of preserving peace by threatening to destroy humankind, and a wish to go into a different direction. To me, it seemed that it would impose an additional burden just to counter this new dimension of threat from the Soviet perspective at a time when, as you've said, the economy was suffering a number of shortcomings in production, and when Marshal Agarkov, the head of the Warsaw Pact, was calling for modernization of the conventional forces, which are more expensive. And so incrementally, SDI added to the conventional force modernization on top of the other weaknesses in the centrally planned economy, all had their effect. I don't think any of us pretend that we promoted that policy with the view that it would bring down Marxism in our terms, certainly not, and maybe not in our lifetimes. Since leaving that cabinet and the opportunity to talk to Russians who were in the Kremlin at the time, many who are honest enough to acknowledge it, and this goes to the question of who won the Cold War, or was it Reagan alone, they said that it probably accelerated the collapse by 5 years. That from Vladimir Lukin, who was their ambassador here for a time, and separately Akhrameyev before he committed suicide. Going to the point of the exchange with Gorbachev on God and Reagan's spirituality, I think that, and this has been written about as well, that the president had a strong conviction, spiritually inspired, that Armageddon would happen someday, and his judgment was that the challenge of his generation was posed primarily the challenge, the threat of annihilation by nuclear weapons, and that he believed that that system, whether by accident or design, could lead to catastrophe, to Armageddon for humankind. And while he was not a deeply religious man, he held this conviction very deeply that humankind could destroy itself, and that his obligation as president was to do what he could to avoid it. And in his mind, nuclear weapons were the leading threat to our survival. Hence his commitment to do what he could to eliminate nuclear weapons. And so I think that could well have inspired that question to Gorbachev, that in the hope that he would have answered it in the affirmative, yes, I believe in God, Reagan would have continued the conversation and said, well, what do you think about Revelations? And it could have gone on for a long time, but I think that's a very likely impetus for the comment, which was not trivial. He made it several times to me, to George Shultz, and felt deeply about it.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. Up front here. No, we'll go with him. He's already... Yeah.
Nate Jones, former intern at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Following up on that, I was wondering, I know you mentioned the Able Archer war scare a little bit, and do you think that that glimpse of nuclear catastrophe had played into Reagan's decision to kind of reach out to the Soviets at all?
I do. I should say, actually, let me say more broadly that one of the debates about Reagan's nuclear policy, there are really two schools of thought, and I definitely fit into the second, but I recognize the first. There are some authors and scholars who argue that Reagan developed his views on nuclear weapons throughout his entire career. And there are a couple of books on the subject, and I don't mean to dismiss them. I just find and people Reagan gave a speech at the 76 convention as he's conceding the nomination to Gerald Ford, for example, where there has a couple of passages that could support this. I don't find it that persuasive. I mean, the second school of thought, really, and is reflected in my book, is that these views grew out of his time in the presidency. And I may be overdrawing this contrast. You can, I suppose, you can combine these, but that by his own admission, when he first saw the what's called the PSYOPs, but the nuclear war plan. that he was quite taken aback, that there were a series of events, particularly in 1983, and you mentioned the key. I mean, it happens to be the year of the Korean Airlines incident. It is the year when of the controversy over the Pershing missiles, and there's an anti-nuclear movement. Reagan sees the television documentary the day after, gets a private showing. But above all, you mentioned Abel Archer, and for those who don't know, it was in about November of 1983, the British and the United States begin getting reports that the United States, there are about to be NATO exercises that the Soviets believe that the United States may be, NATO is about to start an attack. And there are, afterwards there are long debates about, whether they really believe this, was this disinformation, and so on. Reagan really did ask, can they really believe that we were about to launch an attack? I find that it more persuasive that really in his early years in the White House that he really began to develop his views on nuclear policy. And it was easy to write them off at first because the first parts, the first outward signs of this, beginning of 1984, he gives a speech, and it's easy to say, well, this is the beginning of an election year. I mean, it's compatible with all out with straight domestic politics. He's running against Walter Mondale, who's criticizing his Soviet policy. But really, that's really you can trace back the public parts of the policy to 83 and 84.
Yes, gentlemen. Ms. Santer, and we'll get to you then.
Yes, my name is Philip Kaplan. I'm a former Foreign Service officer. I want to go back to this issue of did Gorbachev take the decisions he took because of his concern about American power, SDI, the whole ball of wax, or, as you put it, because, if I understood you correctly, because he wanted a new relationship with the West. Let's accept the latter as our premise for my question. It then becomes the question, why did he want a new relationship with the West? And you can spin it right back because of their being overwhelmed. SDI meant that he would have to make enormous investments in defense. Bulgakov, as Bud McFarlane mentioned, all the rest of it. Or because his economy was cratering. He knew that because Andropov told him. Andropov was his mentor. And Andropov, whatever else you said about him, might say about him, knew what was going on as the head of the KGB, and then in his position for a while as the supreme leader. Or thirdly, which I haven't heard in this discussion yet, but I got here a little late, because he referred a lot to the notion of the underdeveloped Soviet political culture. He used that phrase lots of times, and in public, and in the West. Could it be that he saw himself in that line of Russian reformers, starting back from Peter the Great and the Alexanders and all the rest of it? And there's some evidence, some comments he made, and for that matter that Yeltsin made later, about how Russia was an underdeveloped political culture. There was a lot to be ashamed of. It was time to make changes. So in other words, what I'm reaching for is what is the reason why he wanted to change the system? Was it force majeure because of the economy or American power, or was it because there was some more fundamental motivation? I'm not asking you to be Freud, but...
Yeah. No. I mean, to me, it was not strictly American power. That didn't force an entirely different relationship with the West. I mean, we can do these these hypotheticals of what other outcomes were there, but one can imagine a very long stalemate, stalemate in which, don't get me wrong, the United States is moving further and further ahead economically and technologically, but not that the Soviet Union is abandoning the Cold War. The idea of, the Peter the Great idea, I think, is compatible with what I'm talking about as a new relationship with the West. And the third thing on the economic front is that during this period, really with Schultz in the lead, Reagan gives some speeches, but Schultz is bringing to Gorbachev the ideas really of globalization. I mean, the phrase wasn't around then, but actually in the 87 and 88 was a correspondent covering Schultz, and he used to give a speech where we would roll our eyes and go, "Here it goes again, the same old globaloney," and it sounded a lot like a Tom Friedman column of the 90s or a Bill Clinton speech of the 90s. It was, the world economy is changing. You take this product and it's made in 43 different places. Money moves from, very quickly, and so on. And I found the backup for this. There was a guy named Rich Kozlerich who did the work for it, and so on. And he a couple times took Gorbachev aside to give him this speech, and so, for better or worse from Gorbachev's point of view, he's getting this idea that you really need to join the international economy, and that, I think, is a factor. Gorbachev, describes Schultz as after giving one of these speeches, as he was a real statesman. And is in some ways more admiring of Schultz. In a lot of ways, while he praises Reagan, is more admiring of Schultz. So that's a factor. But I don't think it's just force majeure, no.
Thank you. Mr. McFarlane, did you have a comment specifically on this, or different point? Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll take a couple of questions for sort of a final round of questions and responses. Yes.
Forgive me if this has been covered already, but I think in a session like this that there is a point to be made for a political quality that Ronald Reagan had, is very, very rare in politicians, and that is political courage, to do something that is going to be unpopular and to be so devoutly committed to it that you're quite willing to incur the consequences. And I'm talking about nuclear strategy and the notion that whether one likes or doesn't the MAD doctrine, one can say it worked. And for 35 years, there hadn't been a nuclear war, and it takes on a certain legitimacy simply because there hasn't. And any time you're thinking about taking the country in a profoundly new direction, you have to ask yourself, can you really sell the policy? Is it sound, especially if the old policy worked? One thinks, for example, of the China opening, and the established orthodoxy was that this was a communist regime that happened to be killing Americans in Vietnam, or supplying those who were at the time, killing their own people, and blah, blah, blah. And so to go against that takes a certain amount of political courage. And I think it did for Ronald Reagan to come out with a profoundly different idea, and extended beyond just nuclear strategy, which he said, no, I'm going to go away from offense toward defense. But the established orthodoxy was that détente worked, and that the idea prevalent in the Nixon-Kissinger years that however dysfunctional Marxism was, that there was enough natural resources and capital that they could live forever. And the best we could hope for was to contain the rate of expansion. Well, notwithstanding that in the late 70s, Russian expansion and their influence in country after country, from Angola to Ethiopia, South Yemen, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, would seem to underwrite that thesis, Reagan had the courage to say, no, I don't think so. I think we can compete more effectively and ultimately prevail. Well, it takes a huge amount of courage. And with respect to the SDI dimension of that, he was going up some very bright intellects in Washington, Sam Nunn, Les Aspin, Al Gore, all of them very severe critics of SDI. Margaret Thatcher, probably his closest soulmate internationally, very severe. And I'll tell you a funny story about that someday. But to do that, to stand up and be able to defend going profoundly in a different course from an established orthodoxy adopted by left, center, and right for 35 years takes an enormous amount of political courage. He deserves credit for that.
Thank you. And now the gentleman up front here. And are there any other questions for a final round? Questions or comments? You as well? We'll go these two gentlemen here. And
my name is Ken Hill. George Shultz would ordinarily be identified with the realist school, and I was wondering if you would comment what made him so confident that we could deal with Gorbachev.
Thank you. And we'll take another one.
Well, it was a couple comments that one that Mr. McFarlane made, and it has to do with the how did Reagan's policies bring about the collapse earlier and so forth. One of the big concerns, and it was alluded to, of Marshal Ogarkov, was not the nukes. It was U.S. precision-guided munitions. And, you know, at the time, I had no knowledge of the advances we were making in that field. But the Soviets knew. And this just scared the hell out of them. Because the nukes, they felt, or he felt, would not be used. And the Soviet economy could not match this with the effort that was going into defense at the time. And he wanted more. And he was denied that by Chernenko. And in fact, so firmly that he was fired. And that was the reason, because he needed more. And the reply was, my God, we've always given you so much, and we're giving you so much, this is it. You know, that's the end. And I remember at the time thinking, looking at this from, you know, the Soviet point of view, how fragile the economy was, the strain it was under, and thinking at the time it was during the Reagan defense buildup and these huge deficits we were incurring, and thinking to myself, why are we doing this when it's you know, it's so weak, it's so fragile? So it's a real. I don't think I could answer. It was 5 years, 6 years, whatever, but it was a real factor, very much so.
Thank you. Any other questions, Jim?
Let me just address the George Shultz question, because you know, I'm an author and a journalist. I'm in Washington. Sometimes issues are not. Sometimes they're important issues, and sometimes there's sort of personnel and factional disputes. So I would say there are two why Shultz was took a different position from the people we think of as the realists now. One was economics and one was personnel. On the personnel side, you have to take into account that during the Nixon administration, Schultz had served in 3 senior posts, but all, including Treasury Secretary, but was not involved in the thrust of Nixon-Kissinger diplomacy. And at the time, before Reagan takes office, Nixon sends him his own recommendations for all senior positions in the new administration, and says then of Schultz, he's recommending Al Haig to be Secretary of State, and says that Schultz really, he was good for domestic jobs, but he's not really up to the job of diplomacy. And this comes up again, and after this 87, he tells Reagan that Schultz thinks that negotiating with Gorbachev is like dealing with George Meany, but he just doesn't know. He really doesn't understand high-level diplomacy in the way that Nixon did. So this is, some of this is old-fashioned personnel disputes. Schultz was not of the core of the Nixon foreign policy team. The other part is economics, really, because Schultz does place a greater value on the economic pressures on the Soviet Union and the fact that he does see Gorbachev as possibly changing or being forced to change, because I think he does, and in a different way Reagan does, have a different view of what the Cold War is about than Nixon and Kissinger. I mean, there's less of an emphasis on straight old-fashioned geopolitics and more of an emphasis on economics and ideas. So, underlying it, there's both personnel things and really a larger argument about what the Cold War is all about.
Thank you very much. I would like to conclude, but give perhaps, if I may call on Mr. McFarlane, I would love to hear that funny story about Reagan and Thatcher before we conclude. So,
well, as I said, and one of the mistakes we made, perhaps unavoidably, was in launching strategic defense without time or effort to brief the Allies, and especially European allies, when you're launching something so sweeping as changing from offensive deterrence to defensive strategy. That's something that's going to matter a lot to NATO allies, because the doctrine of flexible response required us to escalate from a conventional war in Europe to use nuclear weapons. And if we began to talk about building a shield over America, where does that leave Europe? Well, Prime Minister Thatcher reacted strongly, and first privately, but then more publicly, in criticizing strategic defense. And over the course of a year, from spring of 83 to 84, she wouldn't let up. And so toward the end of the year, after the election actually, she came to Washington, and it had been pre-announced that she wanted to have it out with Reagan about SDI, and we went to Camp David, and she had such a penetrating intellect, and she really gave him what's known as a handbagging. She said, "Look here, Ron, you're going to disconnect the United States from Europe. You're doing something that's very risky, that very likely won't work. You're spending a huge amount of money on something you really ought to be spending in Europe. And it's going to look to the Russians as if you're developing your own first strike capability." All of those defensible points that had merit. And the president, in his gentlemanly and by that time rigorous rebuttal, tried his best, and she just dismissed it right away, came back with the same 4 points, and we papered over it in a kind of a cordial and mutually beneficial discussion in the press release, and the president took me aside and said, "Bud, this is not great. Why don't you go to see to the first of the year and see if you can't, if not convince her, at least ask her not to be so public in this." Well, after the new year, I went to London and to Downing Street, and I didn't get 2 paragraphs into my talking points before she said, "Bud." And she went through the same handbagging again, just whap, whap, whap. Well, I could see I was getting nowhere, and as I took my leave, I said, "Prime Minister, the President has authorized me to say that he believes we ought to subcontract as much as $300 million a year to British firms on this program." Long pause. And I left. And that year, she was hosting the G7 at the time, and so we saw her 2 months later, 3 months later, and went to a reception for all the G7 delegations at the Victoria and Albert Hall, and everybody goes through the receiving line, and we stood off to the side, and as I went through, she said, "Bud, could I have a word?" And so afterward we went to an alcove nearby, and she said, "I've been giving thought to this." And she hadn't said a critical word in the preceding 3 months. She said, "I think there may be something to this after all."
Thank you very much. Please join me in a round of applause. Thanking Jim Mann. Congratulations on the book. Thank you for your comments and insights and questions. We're adjourned. Thank you for joining us here at the Wilson Center.